Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. Art has often been used as a form of political speech and protest. And during the Nazi occupation of Europe, two French women used their art to run a bold and dangerous anti-Nazi campaign in their chosen home in the British Channel island of Jersey. Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, better known by their pseudonyms Claude, Cahun, and Marcel, took inspiration from the avant-garde art scene, which they were active in, to create paper bullets, small messages and illustrations meant to demoralize Nazi soldiers and convince them to lay down their arms and go home. These paper bullets were tucked into the pages of magazines, left on military vehicle windshields, and even slipped into the pockets of Wehrmacht soldiers. With me to discuss the life and resistance of these brave artists is Jeffrey H. Jackson, author and professor of history at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. Professor Jackson is an expert on European history and culture and has published several books on the subject, including Paris Underwater, How the City of Lights Survived the Great Flood of 1910, and Making Jazz French, Music and Modern Life in Interwar Paris. I'll speak with Professor Jackson about his book on Schwob and Malherbe, Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis, and how they broke societal norms and resisted through their art. Professor Jackson, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, to start off the discussion, Schwob and Malherbe's story is lesser known in European and World War II history. So the real question is, how did you find out about these artists, and why did you take such an interest in them and their story?
Well, I really came to know them through their photography. So that's in large part what they're remembered for today, known for today within the art world. Some of their work hangs in some very well-known museums around the world under the names of Claude Cahun and Marcel, as you said. Those were their artistic names. And I was introduced to them, to those photographs by my wife, actually. My wife is an art historian and has taught a course on the history of photography and knew about them. And I always listened to my wife, and she said, you should take a look at these. It's really interesting. And she knew a little bit about the resistance story. She didn't know much, but she did know a little bit about it. And she said, this might be of interest to you. So I started, first of all, looking at the photographs, and they are amazing photographs, and then trying to find out more about the story of what happened during the war. And once I started looking into the wartime story, I realized that very little had been written about it. A little bit here, a little bit there, but not anything in depth. And so sort of that attraction of both the images and then this untold story just really drew me to it, and I wanted to know more.
Well, your research for this book spanned years, and it took you across the US and the UK to different libraries and museums. Talk about your research process, and was there anything that you found during the research that sticks with you?
Well, doing a book, doing research like this is always like putting a puzzle together. You're always looking for the different pieces of the story and trying to assemble a coherent narrative. This project, I think, was even more so like that than other projects I've done. It was in many ways more challenging than other research projects that I've done, partly because the documents themselves are scattered in a lot of different places. Lucy's work as Claude Cahun, her writing, she's often talked about as a surrealist, and her prose is in fact very surreal. It's very difficult in many ways to try to penetrate. And also, once I discovered in particular Suzanne's documents, which are housed at Yale University, the state of those documents, it's very scattered. It's very sort of disconnected. So she would write a sentence or two and then draw a line, and then write a few more sentences and draw another line, and then write more sentences. But none of those sentences had to do with one another. They were all disconnected. So I had to do a lot of cutting and pasting, so to speak, a lot of really, again, putting the pieces of the puzzle together to try to figure out what the story here was in these very scattered post-war reminiscences. So the process was very challenging, but I think it was fruitful in the end. in terms of something that's really stuck with me, I think I was really surprised by sort of their attitude, the way they talked about their own project of writing these notes, of trying to get inside the minds of the soldiers. What strikes me about it, and I've talked to a lot of audiences about this and a lot of people since I published the book, is that they really saw what they were doing an act of resistance, for sure, but also as a kind of act of rescue. They believed that the German soldiers themselves were victims of Hitler's lies. And so they wanted to sort of reach out to these soldiers in many ways and try to, get them to surrender or to go home, to mutiny, to desert, to help try to save their lives. So it's a very different way of thinking about, what goes on in an act of resistance. But it was something that was very much motivating what they were doing.
When you write about history hundreds or thousands of years ago, of course, there are no witnesses to be interviewed to talk about their experience. In this particular case, when we talk about Holocaust history, World War II history, there still are people alive who recall experiences. Survivors, of course, unfortunately, the number is just dwindling because of the biological clock. And so we want to hold on to them as long as we can to get their stories. In this particular case, did you come across anyone who may have lived at the time there and could talk about what life was like on the island? And also, did either of them have any family members that you were able to track down to add a little extra about their lives?
I didn't really conduct many interviews as part of this process because their own documents, their own words were so rich. And also because they really they were pretty much alone by the time they got to Jersey. They had really sort of left family behind. They didn't have a strong network or a very wide network of people on the island. They were very much loners in a lot of ways. And in fact, only one other person knew what they were doing in this resistance work, and she's no longer alive. They really only let one person in on this secret. So there weren't really many people that I could talk to, at least about their work. There are some oral histories of people on Jersey during those times, and I was able to consult those. And I did have an email exchange with one gentleman who's still alive, and who remembered Lucy and Suzanne a little bit. He didn't know them very well, but he knew about some of their work and had heard of them. So I was able to get a little bit of information that way. But mostly I was focusing on the words that they wrote because their memories are so powerful and so rich.
Well, even people who do have a passing knowledge, let's say, of the history of World War II, sometimes are surprised to learn that the Nazis actually occupied some of the British islands, including Jersey, the longtime home of Schwob and Malherbe. Can you tell us the story of how the Germans conquered the island and their treatment of the residents before we talk about the heroic response of Lucy and Suzanne? And if you could also comment on that last year, that 1944, 1945, where the occupation rule turned even more draconian.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know, as you say, especially in the United States, a lot of people don't know the story of the Channel Islands during the war. We tend to focus on other areas when we think about World War II. But the Channel Islands, Jersey and Guernsey, are the two main islands. They were very important to the Germans strategically because they were part of what they call the Atlantic Wall. So the Atlantic Wall is not literally a wall, but it's a series of fortifications, a series of artillery and other military installations, starting in Scandinavia, going all down the Atlantic coast, and the Channel Islands, which are just off the coast of France, were very much a part of that. I mentioned in the book, for example, that they were so strategically important that Hitler received regular updates on what was going on in the Channel Islands. So they were very important to what the Germans saw as a way to defend against Allied invasion of the continent. So because they were so important, the Germans sent thousands of troops there. I mean, over the course of the war, there were thousands of Germans who circulated those islands. And that's part of why there was such a large secret police force there as well. The secret police wanted to make sure that these very important islands that they were kept, that the occupation was very strong there, that there wasn't any dissent because they wanted to keep that, what they saw as very important work going. What that meant was that because it was so important, they really wanted to enforce the rules. Now, this was not a brutal occupation in the sense that they weren't, actively torturing people, or they weren't, there was still the kind of velvet glove, iron hand and the velvet glove kind of approach on the island for most of the war, even while they were also very actively policing the local population. But as the war went on, things became more difficult, certainly for everyone, in large part because the Germans were no longer able, or had much greater difficulty in supplying the islands. That was especially true after D-Day. So as food became more scarce, as other supplies became more scarce, the policing of the island simply became more, as you say, more draconian. And really, I think that's part of what ends up happening, is that Lucy and Suzanne get caught up sort of in the dragnet of trying to make sure that this strategically important island remained in German hands. As they were beginning to lose battles in the east, and the tide of the war had turned, they still wanted to hold on to this territory as much as they could.
Was there a collaborationist element in the civil leadership of the island?
There was very little really that the civilian leadership could do. The Germans launched what was called Operation Green Arrow, and that was to take over the Channel Islands. So they bombed the major cities, they strafed with bullets, and then landed at the airport. And so, for example, on Jersey, when the plane landed, German officer gets out, there's really very little that the civilian leadership could do, except go and shake hands and basically just surrender the island. What that also meant was that the local leaders were trying to sort of navigate this very difficult situation that they found themselves in. They had to collaborate, basically, because there was really nothing else they could do. They didn't have any. They couldn't connect with Britain. They couldn't connect with France. So there was no other place for them to draw support from. But they also wanted to, sort of protect local population and keep as many of their own people as safe as they could. So going along with the occupation was kind of the way that they believed that they could survive the war. So what that meant was that a very large percentage of the population on Jersey and Guernsey were involved in some kind of work, helping either they were working directly for the Germans or indirectly, sort of because they were employed by the local government, but they were working in some way for the occupation. And yet at the same time, there was also a homegrown resistance that was starting. Some of that, took place in terms of people sort of going slow at work or maybe not showing up for work. Sometimes there were acts of sabotage, acts of stealing, other kinds of things. So really there's kind of a mixed, difficult kind of navigation that the local population is dealing with.
There was a small Jewish community on Jersey, was there not?
That's right. There was a small community. Jews, as in other parts of Europe, certainly they were supposed to identify and register with the occupation authority. Many of them left when the Germans came. Some were sent to prison camps. There were still, even after that, there was still a very small, a handful, maybe 6, 7, 8 people who sort of refused to identify, refused to leave. And I don't know a whole lot about them, but they did survive the war. But that community was pretty small to start with.
But Lucy herself was part Jewish.
That's right.
Did that enter into this in terms of how she identified, either personally or because of the occupation?
Absolutely. Her father's family was Jewish. There were some prominent rabbis in the family, some scholars of Jewish life and historic Jewish history in the family. Like a lot of people of her father's generation of the late 19th century, he had assimilated and sort of given up the faith. Lucy herself did not practice the faith, but was taught a lot about her Jewish family by her paternal grandmother, who shared with her stories and shared with her traditions and things. For Lucy, but Lucy she also definitely experienced anti-Semitism. I mean, there's no question. She grew up at this very powerful moment, this very dark moment in French history at the end of the 19th century during the Dreyfus Affair. And it's a very complicated story, the Dreyfus Affair, but it's this very profound moment of anti-Semitic politics that happens in the late 19th century in France, to the point where there were crowds of people outside the family apartment shouting "Down with the Jews." And then Lucy, a few years later, when she was in school, she was subjected to anti-Semitic taunts and other children throwing rocks at her in school. And so she understood, even though she didn't identify as a Jew in terms of practicing the faith, she certainly felt the effects of anti-Semitism. And once the Nazis start to come to power, I mean, she certainly speaks out against that as much as she can. And I think absolutely that then informs her desire to resist in some way. She's always sort of seen herself as an outsider. Part of that is because of her Jewish family. But then she also, says that she sees where this is going. And she decides that she wants to do something to resist once the Germans come to Jersey.
So Lucy and Suzanne directed the messages on their paper bullets directly to the Nazi soldiers and wrote them under the guise of a Nazi soldier, signing them as the soldier with no name. Give us more detail on those paper bullets and what kind of messages were written on them.
So this was, I think, as artists, they were drawing on their creative skills. But to me, I think these were almost some of their greatest works of art, is to write these notes. And they wrote them in the forms of songs or poems or illustrations. Sometimes they would invent dialogue. And all of them, as you say, or many of them, done using this pseudonym of the soldier with no name. Basically, the idea was to try to find as many ways as they could to get inside the minds of German soldiers, right? So it could be, if maybe a poem would do it, or a song, or a piece of, or a joke, or some of them were written sort of in the form of an angry manifesto. Lots of different approaches, lots of different styles, but using this pseudonym made it seem like it was coming from within the German army. So it seemed like that it was. So the reader, if a German soldier was reading this, he would think, oh, well, this is one of my comrades who feels this way. And it would the hope was that it would kind of evoke within the reader this kind of sense that, if I had doubts myself, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe there are other men, other troops, other soldiers who are also kind of not happy that we're here, or maybe don't fully, buy into what we've been told. With the hope then that they would somehow mutiny or desert or lay down their weapons. So I think it was, in many ways, I think that was Lucy and Suzanne's greatest sort of creative act, was to sort of invent this alter ego and to write notes under his identity.
Do we have any idea whether there was an investigation into this, that the Nazi authorities on the island were looking into this, that they were looking for suspects in this particular instance?
They were looking really for 4 years. Lucy and Suzanne started this early in the occupation, and they continued it until they were arrested in 1944. And all evidence indicates that there was an active, looking for whoever the soldier with no name was. In other words, it was, if they had written it under their own names, I mean, they would have also, I think, come under suspicion, or they would have been, sought after by the occupation forces. But the fact that it was coming supposedly or seemingly from within the army itself made it that much more dangerous. It was something that the secret field police really did want to find. Okay, if this is a soldier doing this, we really have to find out who it is. There were other local people on Jersey who were spreading information or writing various notes. Most civilian note writing, though, was done to the civilian population. Sort of keep your spirits up. Everything will be okay. We can outlast the occupation. Lucy and Suzanne, I think, are really unique, not just on Jersey, but more generally in the war, by writing to the soldiers themselves. And so it made it something that the secret field police really did want to try to find out who was doing this. There were plenty of informers on the island as well, people who were turning in neighbors because they were listening to an illegal radio. Some of the notes that Lucy and Suzanne circulated were actually summaries of BBC News reports as well. Others were doing that too. And as I say, radios had been outlawed early on during the war because they were afraid that the BBC would be communicating information to a possible local resistance movement. But I think that so the secret field police was looking out for anybody who was spreading notes. But Lucy and Suzanne's notes were particularly dangerous because of this identity that they had taken on.
Well, in addition to being artists, Lucy and Suzanne were partners, and they often challenged gender norms. We've talked about how Lucy was half Jewish. So how did their identities play into their resistance, both through paper bullets and through their everyday lives?
Yeah, so I talk about them in the book really as lifelong resistors. I think people don't wake up one day, even in an extraordinary situation like the war, or maybe especially in an extraordinary situation like the war, don't wake up and say, hey, I'm going to be a resistor today. People who become resistors typically do so out of a lifelong pattern, and that's something you see in other stories as well. So I talk about Lucy and Suzanne really being lifelong resistors. They had always been challenging societal norms. They had always been challenging power in one form or another. And that really started with their relationship. So they were a couple. They were a lesbian couple. That was something that when they moved to Paris and right after World War I in the 1920s was more open and more accepted, but still not completely so. There was a lot of skepticism about that, and a lot of people who didn't approve of that. So they also had to sort of navigate very carefully the lives that they lived there. They were used to telling secrets, and they were used to sort of hiding their identities because of that. So that was certainly part of the pattern, this pattern of resistance, of just their own relationship. They also happened to be stepsisters as well. Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother a few years before they moved to Paris. So in a way, they had sort of the perfect cover. When they moved to Jersey, they were able to tell people, oh, we're sisters, which was true. But it allowed them to hide the personal nature of their relationship. But they had also worked together for so long as artists. They had collaborated together on so many different artistic things. And a lot of their work had precisely been about gender identity, about sexuality. If you look at the photographs, and it's very easy, anyone who's listening can go on the internet. You just search for Claude Cahun, search for Marcel Moore. You can find images on my website as well. And you see that a lot of the images that they're doing, a lot of these photographs that they were taking were very intentionally playing with questions about gender. It's very hard to tell often in some of these photographs, whether Lucy, she's usually the one in the photos. It's hard to tell whether she's a man or a woman. It's hard to tell, it's very easy to see that she's blurring those lines. And so the work that they had been doing in their art, that they had, the lives that they had been living as a couple, the fact that they were also engaged in political work, they were associated with communist groups and other left-wing groups, not in an orthodox way. They never joined a party. They never, I don't think were particularly ideological, but they saw a kind of kindred spirit in people on the left, just sort of, breaking the rules and, trying to reinvent society. All of those things together then led them, I think, to already have a kind of resistance spirit. So that when they moved to Jersey, they certainly didn't expect to be involved in this. No one really knew what was going to happen. They thought they were sort of leaving the political world of Paris, which had become very polarized by the 1930s. They thought they were leaving that world behind and going to live a quiet life on this lovely island, essentially in a kind of retirement almost. But instead, circumstances conspired against them. But then they chose to sort of reclaim that resistance spirit that they had been cultivating for so many years in these other parts of their lives.
Well, oftentimes, as we've seen through history, and situations of adversity and extreme adversity often present a situation where people rise to the occasion, and clearly they did. But I'd like to talk about the intersection of art and resistance, particularly avant-garde art. And in the book, you describe the vibrant art scene that Lucy and Suzanne were part of in the 1920s and the 1930s. And then the Nazis come in 1940. How did the Nazi occupation, Paris, Jersey, impact the art scene? And would you talk also about the issue of degenerate art? Because this was very loomed as something major in the Nazi rule to root out, to destroy what they consider to be degenerate art. Tell us about that.
Well, the idea of degenerate art is it's part of the broader category of degeneracy that the Nazis used as a way to talk about their enemies, to talk about what they saw as this racially cleansing project. It's a way to set up sort of an us versus them dynamic. That, you know, our art is pure or our culture is pure, their culture is degenerate and corrupting. And so the idea of degeneracy was a very powerful category for the Nazis, and they applied it to art because that was something that you could somehow see it, right? If you look at modernist art, they believed, you look at modernist art in the 1920s and 1930s, and you could see the corrupting influence of Jewishness, of Blackness, of anybody that they saw as a racial inferior. So the famous, of course, and many people may already know this story of the very famous art exhibition, the Degenerate Art exhibition that the Nazis mount in the 1930s. They collect all of this very famous modernist art from the period, and they hang it up, and they basically make fun of it. Right? It's a way of them to sort of draw people into this exhibit and to sort of showcase what they believe is this horrible modern art. It's also worth pointing out that the very first building project, the very first construction project that Hitler undertakes when he becomes the Chancellor of Germany is what he calls the House of German Art, right? So he understood the power of the visual, the power of art to really sort of grab people. So I think Lucy and Suzanne, part of what I always had to ask myself in this project is why would they put themselves at risk? They had so many reasons to sort of hide. There were many things about them that did put them at risk. Their relationship as a lesbian couple, certainly, but their art was very much a part of that because they were very deeply involved with and embedded with that avant-garde art scene that the Nazis would come to call degenerate. And indeed, when the police raided their house and found a lot of their photographs, the ones I was referring to earlier, that was part of the case against them, so to speak, right? And this comes up in the trial. It comes up there's some one of the reminiscences of one of the leading German soldiers. He says, we arrested these women and they had this horrible art in their house. In other words, it becomes part of the way that they are identified, not just as artists, but as degenerate artists. And so I think that that was something that was certainly from the German perspective, a very powerful category. And yet, I think for artists like Lucy and Suzanne, it was precisely something that they believed, because it had that power, because they understood the power that art had to speak to people. That was the way that they could engage. In fact, Lucy had already in the 1930s written an essay in which she talks about the power that art has to get inside someone's mind, really to get them thinking about things in a different way. And she didn't know that she would have the opportunity to do that in this type of situation. But it was something she was already kind of thinking about in a more sort of theoretical, abstract way. How is it that art can actually change people's minds? And then, of course, she did end up putting that. They both ended up putting that into practice.
And at what point in this 5-year occupation, at what point do they really start to get into trouble?
I think they really start to get into trouble not long before they are arrested in 1944. I think by and large, they fly under the radar and are able to plant these notes, their paper bullets, they're able to distribute these things and really kind of confuse the Germans and they're not really identified until not long before their arrest. It's hard to say exactly how they are identified, but based on the sources that I had, it seems like they are essentially turned in by someone that finds them suspicious. And it's not clear exactly who it is, but I think without that, they probably would have been able to continue on without being detected.
Yeah. And is there a record of the trial?
There's not an official record of the trial. A lot of those documents were destroyed. There are some documents that are still closed in the archive that are not going to be accessible for many more years because of certain rules about, often archives will put a sort of 100-year window on things. And so you can't access these for 100 years after the event. So there are a few documents in the Jersey archives that I wasn't able to look at that won't be accessible to anyone for another, I don't even remember, 20 or 30 years. And some of those may have to do with the trial, but I don't believe that they're like a trial transcript. I think it's just some administrative documents. Most of the information that I have from the trial really comes from Lucy and Suzanne's post-war memoirs. And they were able to recount, Suzanne in particular, she was really the one who was able to, in great detail, sort of record what they had gone through. And so even to the level of some of the dialogue and some of the conversations and things that are said to them during the trial. So I was able to reconstruct that from their own reminiscences after the war.
And they're buried on the Isle of Jersey.
They are. That's right. They're buried in the St. Berlaud's church cemetery, which was really just a very short distance from their house. I mean, they could look out of from their own home and see this cemetery. That cemetery was important to them because that was where the German soldiers who died during the occupation were buried. And so that actually gave them an opportunity. They would go over and spread notes and plant notes during a funeral service. And so it's interesting that later on they would come to be buried in that very same cemetery. Now the German soldiers have been removed; their bodies have been removed and taken to a military cemetery in France. But they're in that cemetery that's just a very short distance from where they lived on Jersey.
Do school children today on the Isle of Jersey study about Lucy and Suzanne?
I don't know that they study about them in particular. I think the story of the history and the memory of the occupation on the islands is very interesting. For a long time after the war, people on the islands really didn't want to talk about the occupation. They didn't want to talk about even the heroic aspects, even people who were resisting in some way or other. And there were a number of people who were engaged in some kind of active resistance. But it was kind of a suppressed memory for a long time. And I think it's only been in the last couple of decades that people have really tried to bring a lot of those stories forward. So I think that if Lucy and Suzanne in particular are talked about, they're probably talked about as part of a number of other stories that have begun to sort of come forward within the Channel Islands themselves about people who resisted. But it's still something that I think people are grappling with and still trying to figure out, how do we talk about that past? How do we talk about that moment? Because for so long, it was just something that they sort of wanted to talk about it more as, well, we just endured this and then it was over and then we moved on with our lives. They didn't really want to investigate those stories, whether they were stories of collaboration or stories of resistance.
Well, in your book, you write, Lucy and Suzanne's story does not easily align with how Europeans have remembered the war. What can their story teach us about that time and how people like Schwob and Malherbe contributed to resistance to the Nazis?
Well, for me, I think one of the takeaways is how many more stories there are. It's been a long time since the end of the war, and yet we're still finding these stories. We're still hearing these voices. For me, I think that's another good reason that historians and people who are interested in things like this really need to get down to ground level. It's often tempting to tell the story of wars sort of from the top down, to tell them in sort of big dramatic arcs and sweeps. But when you really get down into that kind of daily life, the daily lived experience of what it's like to be on the ground during the war, that's when I think you really start to see those kinds of stories emerge. So the more people who are able to do that and hear those voices, I think the more of these kinds of stories that we'll be able to hear, and then to sort of figure out, where do they fit into the bigger narratives? And as I said, and you read the passage there, that they don't fit easily into the narratives that we've already constructed. So maybe that's an opportunity to construct some different narratives and different approaches for thinking about the war experience.
Well, the book is Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis by Jeffrey H. Jackson, and it's available in store or online wherever you purchase books. Professor Jackson, thank you so much for being here with me today and for shedding light on the incredible story of Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, our thanks to Jeffrey Jackson for being on today and speaking with us about his book, Paper Bullets. And thank you for tuning into this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.